So I'm going to give you a little background on our speaker, Jeff. Jeff is an author and paranormal researcher, and he has a passion for the sciences, a background in the military, and a penchant for investigating the unusual. So he's a natural skeptic, but he's very kind-hearted. He has a great sense of humor, and this expert has assured me that he's been able to research and debunk any events or urban myths that may or may not be true, anything that we can think about, including UFOs, whilst assuring us that that there's indeed real supernatural events that do occur. He is a researcher of ancient civilizations, legendary mysteries, and hauntings. And he started work when he contributed to Fate magazine in 2002, has written over 10 books in the past, and this has encouraged him to research and publish his work. Yet the note that what I really want to introduce you to tonight is his background. He has spiritual beliefs that were reformed from an evangelical viewpoint. And through his work on extensive factual, historical, and case studies on reincarnation, he's even has analyzed the Bible's viewpoint on these concepts. So we are so pleased that he could take the time to meet us tonight. And you can explore Jeff's research and his ideas and his experiences on the link provided on our website, also at www.ourcuriousworld.com. So is Jeff with us yet tonight? Hello, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing, Carmen?
Hi, how are you? Nice of you to join us. And
Well,
nice to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here. It's nothing else to do tonight on such a rainy night, so just sit and talk to like-minded people and see if we can learn anything from each other.
Exactly, rather cozy. And that means the rain is coming our way on the East Coast here, too. For the listeners that want to know the weather here while we're at it. That's
right.
Good. So, Jeff, I had just a chance to review some of your work, but why don't you help us understand what you've done? Because you have a wide body of work and background that you've actually authored and penned. Can you tell me a bit more about your your most favorite books that you've actually researched in the past?
Well, asking me which is my favorite book is like asking me which is my favorite child. You know,
Wow.
it's not fair. But I've enjoyed all of them. They've all led me in different directions. The books have been kind of an outgrowth of my spiritual journey. I started out looking at reincarnation, and then that led me into ghosts, and then I would ask things like, well, how does extraterrestrials fit into all this? And so then that would lead me into UFOs. So I just kind of follow the lead of spirit, whatever direction it leads me, and then I try to put together my thoughts into a form that people can get some objectivity with. I don't try to convince people of any one particular position, and I try to point out the flaws as I see them in some people's theories, not to humiliate them or belittle them, but to see if we can find the truth through all of this stuff and come to a better understanding of what's going on in this amazing world we live in.
Yeah, and what I wanted to explain to my listeners is, for example, the type of work that he tends to do. This man is certainly not gullible. He does do his research, and that actually his background is an interesting primer for him to be able to take out any theories or correct on any theories that we might find plausible, such as, I was reading a little bit on your UFO work, and what I found was very interesting was your work that you did on the Majestic documents, your research that you've done on that, and obviously that you had some knowledge as to how these documents were presented in the military or in the CIA, and how that fit into your writing. In other words, he's very good at being able to parse how certain things are presented and sniff out any inconsistencies in major theories that are giving rise to urban myths such as UFOs. In fact, like for example, one of the theories was with the Majestic documents. For those of you that don't know what those are a list of so-called hidden CIA documents that were only being released now, that there are simply not enough to justify the sheer amount of volume of information that should be out there regarding extraterrestrials. For example, right, Jeff?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. I look at the Majestic documents kind of from the perspective of a detective. If someone brought these to me and said, "Hey, look, I got this letter, supposedly signed by, Harry Truman that has to deal with UFOs.
Yes.
The question is, really, how do you approach something like that? Do you look at it logically? You can look at it, forensically. There's a lots of different ways to look at it. And my issue with the UFO community is that there's a need to believe, and it's so strong that a lot of people will accept these things without really doing the hard work of determining whether it's true. Now, that being said, there are those out there who are supposedly experts who authenticate these things. But for every expert who's willing to authenticate it, you can find 5 who will tell you it's bogus. So you're right back to square one again. And that's been really the problem with a lot of the UFO conspiracy stuff all along, is that for everybody you can find that will support it, you can find 5 people who will debunk it, and then you really don't know what's going on out there.
And I appreciate that, because I really want to believe, God knows, we really want them to come in and fix things, don't we?
Absolutely. See if they can do as big a worse a job than we're doing, I suppose. And,
You'd think not, unless they're already involved, Jeff. Then we're in trouble.
well, I think they're smart enough to keep their hands off of things and just say, hey, look, I'm not going to get involved with that mess. Just like neighbors who are fighting. You don't want to go over there and get involved in their squabble.
I know. And so this is interesting. So what this does indicate to me, and what this does illustrate, is your journey, specifically to take just certain ideas, which is mythical creatures, ancient civilizations, UFOs, for example, and learn through the processes of these, or your research, what exactly they were. And then this brought you back around to sort of having decided to study certain things like the Sasquatch, or sorry, that's the Canadian version, the Bigfoot. Was that sort of a side pet project of yours, mind the pun, for your research, or how did that link into your ultimate goal, which was to research in reincarnation?
Well, I suppose of all the different phenomena out there, when I was growing up, I thought the Bigfoot was the one that was most intriguing to me. It was kind of like everybody's boogeyman. And, I remember as a kid seeing this documentary called The Legend of Boggy Creek. And I remember that just scared the heck out of me. And I've been fascinated with this possibility ever since. And I kind of kept tabs on it over the years. And, in fact, it was my first published article was on Bigfoot, the Patterson film. Which really got me started on my writing career. So it's interesting how God used an interest of mine from when I was just a kid and basically used it as the instrument to get me involved in writing full time and moving into all of these other books.
So I'm looking at this here, and that would have been your first, your published novels. Also, I wanted to point out to our readers here that Jeff is now writing out his characters that he has researched. So in other words, he's gotten to know his research so well that he's turning them into stories, which he has samples on his pages. It's very beautifully written, and the only way I could point it out was the word chthonic, which is otherworldly or underworldly. Definitely some very, very dark imagery there. And this brings me into also, I noticed in your private writing, in your novel writing, that you still have a very a strong aptitude towards going back into a sort of a not a military, but a kind of a very strong position or background in which you've always got the good guy and the bad guy, even if it's the creatures, right? Usually I see that through, your amazing story, the Serpent Gigante, sorry. I'm just trying to say that properly. It's such a beautiful title for a book that you have. I mean, I could almost see these being developed into movies. So wonderfully written. Now, this is kind of an expression, I guess, of all the research that you've done over time. So what I wanted to do today was also really focus on, it brought you to this point that you've researched all this material. You want to say something about how this came about. And Jeff, I want you to please give us a little bit of background on where you were brought up, and also what you're doing now. I mean, I see you've been through a very, very varied history with he's an illustrator as well as having illustrated and worked in the military. worked for the military, and has been a writer, a prolific writer. So tell us a bit about yourself, Jeff. I know that not all the way back, but for sure, go into this, because then we're going to go into your past lives. Because I find
In
it's
my
very
past
interesting how
life.
it links up to your current life.
Okay, well, the 5 cent biography is I was a veteran of the Navy. I was in the Navy right out of high school. After that, I went into art school, became a graphic designer. I've been doing that pretty much full time for the rest, since the mid '80s. My background is essentially I was born a Catholic, kind of left the church, became born again when I was 21 years old, was very active in the evangelical churches for a good 20 years. Eventually began to question some elements of my faith, began to search other faith structures and see if I could find some answers there. That led me into reincarnation, which I found to be something that answered a lot of questions for me, and from there it sort of propelled me into just looking at the world in a different way, in a much more expansive way. That has brought me basically to today, where about 5, 6, 7 years ago I started writing these books on different subjects of the paranormal, kind of looking at them from an objective view, and then that has led me ultimately into novel writing. So taking a lot of these creatures that I've read about, even if I haven't written about them before, and using them as characters in novels. I think it's a much more entertaining way to teach people about the world out there. I decided to come up with a different kind of twist on it. I'm a happily married man, and I thought it would be kind of neat to have the characters in my trilogy be a husband and wife, scientists, who go off looking for these different creatures and inevitably finding them. That way you have not only the interesting creatures that they come up with, but also their interaction, how they work with each other, how they interact and play off each other's strengths and weaknesses to get out of the fixes they find themselves in. And I think that's what makes my books unique. Is they're not just about finding a monster and defeating it, but it's also about how they will sacrifice for each other and how their love comes through when they're in these situations together, and how they just try to find ways to get out of it. And the one of the characters in these books is a strong Christian herself. So, and then her husband is more of an agnostic. So you got that dynamic at play too. How does her faith, affect the fact that she's a scientist and how she looks at these creatures? So
Jeff,
I try
would
to
your
handle a lot of
wife
different
mind
things
if
in
we
one
asked
place.
what background she was from?
Pardon again?
Your wife, what background is she from?
My wife?
Your real life
my
wife.
wife. Yeah, my wife is. She's been strong in the church all of her life, and she's been very supportive of my looking at different things, and she's gone in this journey with me. So I think that a lot of my experiences with her in our lives, how we work together, has translated into these books. So
I can see that.
so that's kind of the way I wanted to do it. I just thought it'd be a nice way to do it, to tell stories that are entertaining and still tell us a message beyond just the action itself.
Yeah, that's correct. And so one of the things, so do tell me, and now you were Catholic, and then you actually went into evangelism. And for the layman who doesn't understand the process of how it is to be snapped up into a spiritual endeavor, could you explain to us how you were led into this particular path, and then how you left, and just give us a little background of that, because we're always curious about people that have we're afraid of and in awe of people that have so much faith,
Well,
right?
I don't know where faith comes from. I don't know why one person seems to be interested in faith and another person isn't. I don't know if that's a genetic thing.
Yeah,
Or
that's a
what
good
it
point.
is. But I remember ever since I was very young of always being aware of God and interested in God. I didn't really, I was too young to have any kind of an articulated faith, but I was familiar with some of the Bible stories through the Catholic Church and through my catechism classes. And so when I was a young man, I was very curious about these things, and I had met a number of people who were strong Christians who answered a lot of my questions. And one day I just said, well, this seems to be, where I belong. And so I became a Christian. I became trying to make myself as knowledgeable a Christian as I could by, I read the Bible. I read a lot of religious literature over the next few years, tried to make myself at least as knowledgeable as I could for not having any formal theological training. And I really enjoyed those years as a Christian. I think that I learned a lot about myself, about other people, but there was also a discontent. I always was more or less afraid of God. I was always trying to please God, do things that I thought would make him happy. And that always sort of tainted that relationship. And I also had issues with things like hell. How could a good God send anybody to hell? I had issues with the second coming. They were always talking about Jesus is coming and just never showed up. And I thought, well, somebody's got something wrong here. And because of that, I began to look at other ideas. And so one day I just felt like I had gotten as far as I could with Christianity. And if I was going to evolve spiritually any further, I didn't have to abandon it, but I had to move on to the next set of lessons, if you will. And that's how I sort of leave it. Pardon?
Which led you on to research for your writing, or how long did this evolution take for you? I mean, I see here that you started writing in 2002.
Right. I had been playing around with writing over the years. Some of these manuscripts that are being published now are written, 15, 20 years ago. So I was at the time I was a Christian. I was also looking at doing some writing. I did some Christian-based writing, but I was basically just learning how to write. You have to write a lot of stuff before you're ready to actually publish something, and so I was going through all that. But the writing was kind of a natural outgrowth of my creative energies. I was working for many years as an illustrator and a graphic designer. And that was, one outlet, but it wasn't the fullest expression of how I wanted to do things. I wanted to really paint pictures with words more so than with, pigment and pencil. And so that was a natural transition to go from artist to writer. And it was kind of, I felt like I had been led there over a long period of time, 15, 20, 25 years, to finally get to the point where I had enough life experience and had read enough that I could reasonably write and be saleable. And so it's been a tremendous adventure ever since, just putting words to paper and enjoying when people write me and say, I really liked your book, I really got something out of it, it answered some questions for me. And that's what makes it all worthwhile.
Sure does. And now when it must, and that is something I want to experience one day too, Jeff. And Jeff, I wanted to ask you, so we're going into, I have a lot of questions here. I actually have some prepared for you, because many of us are familiar with the concept of reincarnation, usually the Buddhist or the Hindu version of reincarnation. And I was looking over some of your research and descriptions in some of your writings, and I was impressed to see you actually sort of pretty much understanding or trying to understand and also refute some of the Christian versions of reincarnation. In other words, there are Christians, for those of you that don't know this, but there are certain sects of Christianity, and I believe of Islam as well, that will be interested in ideas or notions of reincarnation. Yet you took some of these ideas and you took them apart. Why is that?
Well, I'm of the opinion that people hold a small amount of the truth, and they tend to embellish and make up the parts that aren't complete. And I think this is true whether it's reincarnation or any religious belief system. You get an element of the truth, and then the rest of it seems to be appendages that people have added over the years that tend to take away from the underlying message. And so with reincarnation, I wanted to examine it not only from an Eastern standpoint, but from a Western standpoint, to see if there's any correlations, if there's any consistency between it,
That's
and
right.
where it's inconsistent. Where I can see things that don't make sense. And so I kind of did a little bit of both. I tried to think both East and West while I was writing on this subject, to try to find the things in it that just kind of resonated with me and that had reinforced my own experiences. And the result was a couple of different books on the subject that laid out my case for how reincarnation works to the best of my understanding. I might be completely incorrect about a lot of it, but this is at least where I'm at with it, and see if it resonates with anyone else.
Do tell us a bit about the history of our reincarnation, if you don't mind, Jeff.
Well, reincarnation is actually one of the oldest belief systems on Earth. It goes back into antiquity. It seems to almost have been a natural part of people's belief systems. So early man didn't really understand that when you died there was nothing else. Atheism is a fairly modern invention, and people just assume that you went on, and they would notice that, for example, a child would be born who had very many of the characteristics of an uncle or an elder that had passed. And they just naturally assume that, okay, well, this child must be the reincarnation of this elder. And so these beliefs were embellished over the centuries. They became much larger, much more sophisticated. And then really about the time of Christ, when Christianity first came along, about the 3rd or 4th century, as a major religious force, they began challenging the whole notion of reincarnation, because it was based off a very different perspective, was that you only live once, and then comes the judgment. Whereas reincarnation is you live many, many times, and you go through many judgments. And so the two concepts were just not compatible. And so there's been this battle really ever since between East and West over whether or not the soul does reincarnate over and over again, or whether there is just a single experience.
I know, wouldn't that make them kind of lazy? I mean, you'd think about a populace, right? The population. If they were told they could misbehave or allowed to misbehave a little in one life, and then they'll reap that, most people psychologically will go, well, then I'll deal with that in my next life, right?
Well,
Generally, that's the way
you could
people
make the
think.
case both ways. Because within Christianity, of course, you can do all sorts of nasty things, and then if you're contrite and repent, well, you're not held accountable for it. So you can be a nasty person all your life, except on your deathbed, if you genuinely embrace Christ, all of that goes away. So there's also Christians who say, well, look, I'm going to deal with it on my deathbed. I'll just do what I want to do now. And deal with later. So you see that mindset in both East and Western religions. Yes, there are people in Eastern religions who say, I'm not going to worry about it in this lifetime, I'll deal with the next lifetime. But there's also people who are very trapped in being very careful about everything they do, because they don't want to deal with it in the next lifetime. They realize it's going to be much worse. And if you're already born in poverty and you're thinking, my goodness, I'm going to come back even worse shape next time to pay for all these crimes, then you're going to try to behave yourself. But it's human nature to try to want to get away with things, if you will. And both Eastern and Western faiths give you that opportunity if that's your mindset. But that's a very simplistic approach to these ideas.
You were saying that I was reading through some of your history. Now, for those of you that haven't had a chance to look at his history, Jeff has regressed into his past life. Now, one of the things he does discuss in his site and in his book is that he really was very particular about researching some of these past life regressionists, correct? And also the psychology behind it. So what I liked about his work was the way he was able to describe certain questions that we have, as in, if you're being interviewed by a past life regressionist, surely they're just going to make sure that you believe in your past life, right? And one of the things is that I would say that that is probably, from my perspective, if I may bring an analogy, not true, because then you would think that I, as a psychic, will believe everything that is either spun out to me by other psychics or everything that I even say myself, so that I would want to cross-reference everything. In fact, if anything, being a psychic has been made me extremely skeptical towards the spiritual industry, Jeff. And it makes me a lot more discerning. And I think that's partly what you have to understand when you listen to or read some of his work, is that he's done a very thorough job of trying to explain those questions that we have. So in other words, suggestibility, if one is suggestive. Explain that, Jeff, to us, please.
Right. One of the biggest criticisms of reincarnation is that the therapist who's putting you under can just suggest different ideas to you, and you pick up on them. And in an attempt to sort of appease the therapist, you will play along or make up things that you think the therapist wants to hear. And there are also people who have very fantasy-prone personalities. They really do imagine that they are Napoleon or somebody like that. And so reincarnation can sort of reinforce those fantasies. So when you're really dealing with reincarnation, you have to be aware of the human propensity to want to believe in, unusual or strange things. That being said, if you are aware of that going into it, then and you can, explain away some things using that explanation, what you're left with is the things that can't be explained so easily. The past life memories that are verifiable, or the past life memories in children as young as 3 or 4 years old, who would not be prone to making up stuff as complex as the lives they describe. So you can always find explanations for a lot of it, but I try to get it down to that part of these experiences that you can't explain scientifically or psychologically, and that's really where the truth lies in those areas.
Right, and you were saying, like, for example, some of the cases that were interviewed, like, for example, I want to go into your story, but let's say you take your cousins or your nephews, your niece, your nephew. You were saying in your writing that they had fairly ordinary, unremarkable past lives, something that you would probably not really attribute to anything much special under regression. And I, for one, have come across many a person. I can't tell you how many. I've met a few Cleopatras and quite a few rock stars. People are always reincarnating themselves into highly attractive people. And it's interesting to say to somebody, well, do you know that, for example, the countenance of Cleopatra, that nobody has a record of what she looks like? Yet everybody wants to adopt her countenance, right? Do you know that there's actually only one coin that exists with her actual profile, and she wasn't as attractive as she was made out to be.
When
she
you're
was
that
probably
powerful, I
quite
guess you
homely.
don't need to be.
Sorry?
When you're that powerful, you don't need to be attractive. But
Yeah.
you're
It's all
bringing
the
up an
eye, but
interesting.
it's interesting to see people saying, "Well, I must have looked like that," And it's
Well,
like, really, you
I
have to do
think
your
I think it's
history.
the
You have to
idea that you
research
have an
that.
exciting past life. If your present life is kind of ordinary, there's people who are very attracted to this idea that I was much more interesting before, and that's
Yes.
a trap that you have to be careful about, because it's easy to be caught up in that. But in the therapists that I've talked to who do this for a living, who regress people, the majority of them say that most of the past lives that people recount are very ordinary. They're not famous people. They're just farmers or housewives, or they're soldiers or whatever, and they're not really that interesting of lives in and of themselves. And that's what I think makes them so interesting and so authentic, is the fact that if we do live past lives, the chances are that very few of those past lives were of somebody of note. We were probably just very ordinary people, just as we usually are in this life. And to me, that was one of the most compelling evidences for it.
And what is the most ordinary past life that you've heard of? for
Oh,
example?
well, like I was telling you with my niece, she was a printer at some little print
That
shop in
is fascinating. A
Pennsylvania.
printer, yes. I mean, that
I
is rather
mean,
obscure for her to know that, and
and she was
yeah.
talking about different printing presses, different types of processes that they use to make the plates. And she doesn't know anything about this stuff in her normal life, but she seemed to have a kind of an understanding of how early 20th century printing worked. And even though it wasn't particularly exciting, I thought it was interesting that she was able to describe this process of printing. That really would be something only someone who had worked actually on a press would really know.
So, like, when you have these characters that come through from the past, is there ever, this is a silly question, I know, but for the layman, is there ever an animal that comes through? Like oink oink or squawk or anything like that? Can we jump from species in our
Well,
reincarnations?
there are people who claim that they can remember being an animal, an eagle or a dinosaur or something like this, but my research has shown that this is very unusual, very rare. You don't see it very often. Most people recall lives lived as humans, and I think the reason for that is because an animal's limits in intellect and its ability to understand what's happening to it, it would really not have much to remember. Animals' lives are very straightforward. They
It's
eat,
possibly
they
true.
procreate, they die, and that's pretty much the extent of it. Whereas humans, we think about our place in the universe and why we're here and all these different things like that. And so it makes more sense that you would remember something that's closer to what you're aware of now than it would be that you would remember being a cow or a chicken or something like that.
That's true. They might not even have knowledge of how their language, how they would have expressed themselves. Jeff, one moment, we are going to go to a commercial break. We're going to
Okay.
take about 30 seconds out. My producer is going to put you through. Thank you. Sit back for just one moment, and we'll get on to our next questions.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Hi, Jeff. We're back. Okay, so we have you here on for our next questions. So we were discussing animal lives, and then I was going to take it into, of course, the very next thing, which was then I'm sure we would not remember we were plants. But the question here, too, is in a sense, what happens to plants? Do they evolve into animals, or do they even have, I know that we're not aware of them having a consciousness, but where do they fit into the reincarnation cycle, so to say?
Well, you got to remember that all life is emanates from the divine. Okay, so all life is essentially an aspect of God, and I believe that things like plants and very basic animals, I think they live in a sort of quasi world of their own, and they're not really there to develop. They're just there to be plants or to be a butterfly or to be whatever it is they're supposed to be, and then they shed that form and they move on to other experiences. Maybe there'll be some other kind of plant or some other kind of animal. Eventually, however, this energy coalesces into higher levels of awareness, what we would call consciousness. And eventually, these energies begin to come into more human form, or conscious forms. And that's where the real spiritual evolution takes place, is once you reach that point. And so, to answer your question, plants and animals really don't reincarnate per se, in the respect that they would have memories of being something in the past, or of experiences in their past life. But that's not to say that they may not have an influence on our conscious incarnations. For example, people have a very strong affinity a lot of times with animals, horses or dogs and cats and things. I mean, I have 3 dogs of my own. I think are almost like our children. And I wonder if that affinity that we feel for animals and things like that, or the beauty of plants, isn't a part of our memory of having been in that world many, 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 many thousands and thousands of years ago.
That's very possible. And this is one of the things we wanted to get into. So Jeff's background, his past life regression tell us about that, Jeff. It's actually quite an interesting story.
Well, when I was a teenager, I was extraordinarily fascinated with World War II. I don't know why, because I didn't come out of a military family. I was living on a farm in Minnesota, grew up in the country, but I was fascinated with World War II. I was interested in Germany, and it seemed like that was my preoccupation. And I never understood why. Because it made me very different from most people. I wasn't into music. I wasn't into all this stuff my fellow students were into. I was just into military history. And then many years later, when I began to study reincarnation and I was regressed, it turns out that I actually had been a soldier during the Second World War in Germany. And I was killed in the fighting in Russia very early on in that war. And that explained to me a lot of my affinities that I had for German, even down to the footwear I used to wear. I used to wear these black Wellington boots. That was the only footwear I had. I didn't have tennis shoes. I didn't have anything else but these black Wellingtons. And if you think about it, a black Wellington boot is very close to the jack boots that the German soldiers wore. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's probably the closest equivalent you could find would be the jack boots. And so it was just amazing to me how that life dictated so much of my adolescence and my affinities and my fascinations for things. And then when I was able to go into that regression, I was able to come up with a lot of information about who I was back then, where I came from, where I grew up, how I became into the Army, and all these different things, which to me was really kind of reinforcing what I had already felt deep inside me, and really gave me an insight into how the whole process works.
This is, so would you say you have more of an affinity, you talk about the Germans, with German culture, or did you have to relearn that from this point?
Well, what happened was, in high school, I took German. That was one of the languages offered, and that was the only one I was interested in taking. I'm not particularly good at it, but I was interested in that culture. I've never been to Germany. I still haven't been to Germany.
Oh, you must come. My background is German. We would love to have you there.
Well, okay, I'll come over there. But
okay,
one of these days,
we'll be
who
waiting.
knows? Maybe I'll get on out there. But
you bet.
It just seemed to be just a natural attraction to me. But that being said, as I got older, I was able to move past that and develop other interests and other affinities and other things in other areas. And by the time I was in my 30s or 40s, this was no longer as big an issue in my life as it had been when I was an adolescent. And that's good, actually, because you don't want to just relive an old incarnation under a new name. You want to move on to new experiences. But you do have to be aware that what happened to you in past lives does seem to impact what happens to you to some degree in this life. And I'm not talking karma. I'm talking about just the choices you make, the things you like, the things you dislike. I don't know if you've ever met people that you just immediately took a liking to or took an immediate dislike to. These are often echoes from a past life, either positive or negative, and it just made more sense to me of why I look at the world the way I do once I understood this.
So one of our my co-hosts is asking about your age, and I think what the link up is saying that you were probably in your embryonic form, transitioning from the World War II, or are you talking about World War One? But I believe you're talking about World War II,
Hmm.
into your current life. And so, how long would you have do people go into storage for extended amounts of time? And then that brings me to my one segue in this study that you made. And if anybody gets a chance to please read his articles on ghost personalities, they are phenomenal. He's written a book on ghosts, and he was actually able to typify the psychological breakdown of departed spirits, which I had a really good chuckle at because it's really the way I've been trying to describe it. The difference between orbs, family spirits, pet spirits or animals. We're talking about traditional hauntings, inanimate spirits. So he did a fair amount of research and categorization of spirits. So we wanted to ask you, would you have been put into storage or have been put into a form? Would you have haunted Russia?
All right. Well, it's kind of a complex system. The more I research it, the more complexity I see in this whole process. You've got to understand that the personality is something we take on when we come into the flesh. Just like we take on a body, we also take on a personality. It's shaped by our experiences, our background, our upbringing, what kind of parenting we had, and all those things go into shaping that. And then as we grow older, we begin to think of our personality as who we are. Although it's really not who we are. We're actually a soul being, and we have a personality that exists higher and above what our current personality is. So the question is, what happens when you die? Well, obviously the body is shed, but also the personality lingers for a time, and this is what becomes the ghost. And the soul itself returns to its source, to the spiritual realm, and continues to reincarnate. But that personality may linger for anywhere from a few weeks to months to decades in some
So
cases,
for those of us
depending
that
on the
need
psychology.
clarification, the ghost is actually like a replica of your old soul. It might only be literally the electro like handprint, but yet it can in certain environments linger and harass a susceptible person. But it's good to know that in between we don't have any kind of that we're not stuck having to sit with our neighbors or haunt our place of death. I mean, that's a very comforting thought. For those of us that
Right.
actually do believe in life after death, the ones of us that wonder why we get stuck in between, it's really comforting to hear it's not the real soul.
Right. The soul itself is immortal and impervious. It goes on forever. But those personalities are temporary things that we inhabit. And sometimes if you die with unfinished business or perhaps with a lot of rage, a lot of negative energy in your life, things like that, these things can keep you that soul sort of stuck here. Instead of being absorbed back into the spiritual realm, it actually lingers, kind of with one foot in the spirit and one foot in the physical realm. And that can be, I think, a very unpleasant experience for some people. But it's a temporary experience, and it's something that maybe they need to go through before they're ready to move on to the next spiritual lesson. So, in other words, it's such a series of complexities involved here. It's hard to say, okay, when you die, you do A, B, and C, and then you do this. I think there's a lot of different options that we face, and a lot of different directions that we can move when we shed this fleshly husk of ours and move on. And
Beautiful
being a
word,
ghost
yeah.
is one of them, and reincarnating is another one.
Now, this is the weirdest question I'm ever going to put towards you. Maybe you can just stay with me here. I was reading up on, there's certain aspects of your writing. Like, there was a quote in your biblical research about, we're talking about people misinterpreting Christ having come back to life and then being reborn and them having taken that as a sign, as reincarnation. And my point was more in the sense of this. So, like, if you die here and you, for some reason, because a lot of people are working on life extension, whether it's probably artificial, okay? And that would be truly a terror, but I know that many of us are expecting that through modern science. So what happens if you suddenly you die for 45 minutes, let's say, and they bring you back to
Mm-hmm.
life? Could it be
Right.
possible that you ever get reincarnated and then come back into your old body?
Actually, that may be one option. You may have an opportunity to come back into the flesh and go down a different road. You could make completely different decisions. So I think that you have an option to come in as another person, another gender, another race, and experience things from that perspective, or do your life over again, but just go down a different path than you would on this one and
So you get a
explore an
second
entirely
chance,
different.
maybe, in a way.
It's kind of like a second chance, but of course you don't remember the other road you went down. So it's not really like redoing it. It's like moving down an entirely different road. I mean, have you ever wondered what your life would be like if you had a different set of parents than you did? Or if you were born in another place and time than you were? Your life would probably be very different. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that you may have that option of having a different experience within the context of the same incarnation. Who knows? You may be able to have multiple incarnations at the same time,
I
because
was
they're all
going to
being
ask you
generated
about
by
that.
the same parent's soul.
I was
So
going to
they're
ask you
more
about
like
that.
siblings. Pardon?
Jeff, one of my clients once tried to ask me when her cat had passed,
Yeah.
why an infinite number of cats came to visit her. I just thought I'd relay to you that story. She was very confused at seeing a million of her little kitten come back to her. That made
Mm-hmm.
me feel, and it would have probably been too daunting for her to imagine this, that her cat had actually been replicated into maybe a million different other lives. What
Yeah.
is beyond, like when we have ascended our 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 course, our action at this point, do we just go into one being, or could we not just somehow become an intelligent multi-being? What happens, or do we become the Godhead?
Well, I believe that we become incorporated back into the Godhead. I think that we are like cells in God's body, and we are God's mechanisms that He uses to, or she, whichever your preference is, to experience itself. In other words, as long as God is spirit, he or she can not really experience anything. They can conceptualize everything, can understand everything, but can't experience. In other words, how does God experience hunger or pain or depression or any of those things? He can
Maybe
only
through
do it
us.
conceptually. So he has to come into the flesh, or she, in through us. And we are the ones who feel these things. We have these experiences. And through those, God gets a chance to experience itself. So that when we do die, we are actually incorporated back into the greater godhood, if you will. We become aware of God on that level. Now God's not just some, abstract concept out there. We're actually part of that Godhead now. We have that clarity, that understanding that we don't have on this planet. And then we decide, what do we want to do next? What other experience does God want to have through us? And then we make a decision. Do we want to come back into the flesh? Do we want to go to another realm of existence, a different dimension entirely? I
That's
think that the
right.
choices are remarkable.
So are we stuck on Earth if we want to reincarnate from Earth? Do we all have
No,
earthly memories? Does that mean once we've, can we leave this planet, do you think?
oh, absolutely, absolutely. However, think of Earth as a particular college. If you are going to college and every semester you change colleges, it becomes very difficult to keep a continuity in your education and your learning. So I think that we often choose to come back to Earth because this is a particular venue that we find comfortable
It's a
and
great
that we
venue.
need to sort of see all the way through. If we start jumping from planet to planet, then we kind of start from scratch again with a whole new venue, and that can be maybe a little detrimental to our growth. Who knows?
The question I wanted to ask you, and that's one that we all ask, why are we conscious now?
Well, we can't be unconscious because we are an emanation of the divine, and as long as God is alive, God is consciousness. And we are that aspect of Him. We are conscious of that. The problem is that we tend to forget that, or we try to hide from it or bury it under all of the little things we do and say every day. And that's why when people become aware of the fact that they are a part of God, it changes their lives, because suddenly they become conscious in the way God is. And it changes everything about their lives and how they look at it and how they live it, if they have really, truly come to that understanding.
So would you say that one is more conscious in this life? Am I talking to some people that are unconscious, even if they pretend they are?
Well,
Is
what you're
it a
talking to is
ruse?
people have different levels of consciousness. Some people are still in a fairly primordial state. They're very into the moment, into the flesh, into the pleasures of the flesh, whatever it is that's going on at that moment, and they're not looking beyond that. And then other people seem to be able to rise above that, and they have that kind of overwhelming awareness.
So in a way, when you think you're conscious, you are.
Well, the farther you realize you have to go, the more conscious you are. It's kind of one of those things like you're not really an adult until you realize how childish you are.
That's
it
true.
Seems like a
That's
contradiction.
True.
And so the more spiritually conscious you become, the farther you realize you need to go yet.
Well, yeah, that is the greatest question I've had on my mind, and it just seems the further one goes on in life, the more conscious one becomes. And we would love an end to that. And before I have to, unfortunately, we have to probably say our goodbyes, but I wanted to ask you, for those of us that don't want to come back, we just don't wanna, can we go to bed for a bit? Can we decide to wake up in a million years? What
Absolutely.
do you think that one can do, or does one have to go back to school?
No, I think that a person can do whatever they feel led to do. The question is, once you realize that living life is the only game in town, you're going to be willing to come back to it. However, nothing is ever forced upon you. I think the one thing God has given us is free will, and that's the free will to come back, or the free will not to come back if we don't want to, or to come into some other experience that has nothing to do with what we've had up to now.
Goodness, that is such a relief, Jeff, for all of us out there that are going to have sighs of relief and a much better night's sleep, is that there is, that there is a free will even to how one spends one's afterlife. It's very, very enlightening. I really did enjoy our chat. We might be disconnected for now. I'm going to have to introduce our next week's guest. But Jeff, thank you so much. And for those of you that want to review his work, his work is on ourcuriousworld.com. He has published through Llewellyn, which is a very large mystic book publisher. They usually only take on the best writers. I want to tell you, he is of a very high caliber. The book that we were talking about today was The Case for Reincarnation. And we have other, his novels are listed on there, including his new book called The Night Man, which is also a Sasquatch mystery. So...
Well, Carmen, I really had a great time. I appreciate you having on, and I look forward to hearing from any of your readers through my website.
Yes,
listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
You too, dear. Bye-bye.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
So I'm going to give you a little background on our speaker, Jeff. Jeff is an author and paranormal researcher, and he has a passion for the sciences, a background in the military, and a penchant for investigating the unusual. So he's a natural skeptic, but he's very kind-hearted. He has a great sense of humor, and this expert has assured me that he's been able to research and debunk any events or urban myths that may or may not be true, anything that we can think about, including UFOs, whilst assuring us that that there is indeed real supernatural events that do occur. He is a researcher of ancient civilizations, legendary mysteries, and hauntings. And he started work when he contributed to Fate magazine in 2002, has written over 10 books in the past, and this has encouraged him to research and publish his work. Yet the note that what I really want to introduce you to tonight is his background. He has spiritual beliefs that were reformed from an evangelical viewpoint. And through his work on extensive factual, historical, and case studies on reincarnation, he even has analyzed the Bible's viewpoint on these concepts.
Which is my favorite book is like asking me which is my favorite child. You know,
Wow.
it's like, it's not fair. But you know, I've enjoyed all of them. They've all led me in different directions. The books have been kind of an outgrowth of my spiritual journey. I started out looking at reincarnation, and then that led me into ghosts, and then I would ask things like, well, how does extraterrestrials fit into all this? And so then that would lead me into UFOs. So I just kind of follow the lead of spirit, whatever direction it leads me, and then I try to put together my thoughts into a form that people can get some objectivity with. I don't try to convince people of any one particular position, and I try to point out the flaws as I see them in some people's theories, to not to humiliate them or belittle them, but to see if we can find the truth to all of this stuff and come to a better understanding of what's going on in this amazing world we live in.
Yeah, and what I wanted to explain to my listeners is, for example, the type of work that he tends to do. This man...
Just of it, I look at the majestic documents kind of from the perspective of a detective. If someone brought these to me and said, hey, look, I got this letter, you know, supposedly signed by Harry Truman that has to deal with UFOs.
Yes.
The question is, you know, really, how do you approach something like that? Do you look at it logically? You can look at it, forensically. There's a lots of different ways to look at it. And my issue with the UFO community is that there's a need to believe, and it's so strong that a lot of people will accept these things without really doing the hard work of determining whether it's true. Now, that being said, there are those out there who are supposedly experts who authenticate these things. But for every expert who's willing to authenticate it, you can find 5 who will tell you it's bogus. So you're right back to square one again. And that's been really the problem with a lot of the UFO conspiracy stuff all along, is that for everybody you can find that will support it, you can find 5 people who will debunk it. And then you
is certainly not gullible. He does do his research, and that actually his background is an interesting primer for this, for him to be able to take out any theories or correct on any theories that we might find plausible, such as, you know, I was reading a little bit on your UFO work, and what I found was very interesting was your work that you did on the majestic documents, your research that you've done on that, and obviously that you had some knowledge as to how these documents were presented in the military or in the CIA, and how that fit into your writing. In other words, he's very good at being able to parse how certain things are presented and sniff out any inconsistencies in major theories that are giving rise to urban myths such as UFOs. In fact, like for example, one of the theories was with the majestic documents. For those of you that don't know what those are a list of so-called hidden CIA documents that were only being released now, that there are simply not enough to justify the sheer amount of volume of information that should be out there regarding extraterrestrials. For example, right, Jeff?
Yeah, that's the
concepts. So we are so pleased that he could take the time to meet us tonight, and you can explore Jeff's research and his ideas and his experiences on the link provided on our website, also at www.ourcuriousworld.com. So is Jeff with us yet tonight? Hello, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing, Carmen?
Hi, how are you? Nice of you to join us. And
pleasure
nice
to
to
be
have
here.
you here.
Well, it's great to be here. It's nothing else to do tonight on such a rainy night, so just sit and talk to like-minded people and see if we can learn anything from each other.
Exactly, rather cozy. And that means the rain is coming our way on the East Coast here too. For the
Yeah, we'll
listeners
shoot
that
it
want to
over
know
there.
the weather here while we're at it. That's
Right.
good. So, Jeff, I had just a chance to review some of your work, but why don't you help us understand what you've done? Because you have a wide body of work and background that you've actually authored and penned. Can you tell me a bit more about your your most favorite books that you've actually researched in the past?
Well, asking you